The sky above Prime had turned black, not the peaceful black of night, but something wrong, something alive. Elder stood at the observation window of the last orbital station and watched his world die below him. The crystal spires of the capital city, structures that his ancestors had built over 10,000 years, crumbled one by one. The floating gardens, home to flowers that existed nowhere else in the universe, fell from the sky and vanished into the spreading darkness. The devouring tide had come, and nothing could stop it. Was old, even by standards. His feathers had turned white long ago, and his hollow bones ached with every movement. He had seen much in his life. He had never seen anything like this. The tide was not an army, it was a hunger, biomechanical horrors that consumed everything in their path. They ate cities, they ate forests, they ate oceans, they ate people, and with every meal they grew stronger, they grew larger. They made more of themselves from the matter they consumed. Elder, a young said from behind him. Her name was Lyra and her voice was shaking. The southern continent has gone silent. We have lost contact with everyone there. Did not turn from the window. How many? 800 million souls, Elder. He closed his eyes. 800 million, gone in less than a day, and the tide was still spreading, still hungry. Have we received any response to our distress calls? He asked. Lyra was quiet for a moment. The Galactic Concord has acknowledged our transmission. They say they are monitoring the situation. Monitoring. Let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any joy in it. They watch us die and call it monitoring. He could not blame them, not really. The conquered species had evolved on gentle worlds, worlds with mild weather and low gravity and no predators. They had never needed to fight. They had diplomats and philosophers and artists. They did not have warriors. Against the tide, they were helpless. Send another transmission, said. Send it on every frequency. Send it to everyone. Send it everywhere. Elder, the conquered will not. I know what the conquered will not do. Finally turned to face her. His eyes were wet. But perhaps someone else will hear. Perhaps someone else will come. Lyra nodded and hurried away. Minutes later, the transmission went out. It carried across the stars in all directions, a cry of desperation from a dying world. Most of it fell on deaf ears. Most of it reached species too scared or too weak to help. But some of it traveled further than intended. It reached the edge of known space, past the quarantine zones and warning beacons. It reached a system that the conquered had avoided for 200 years. It reached Saul. Captain was sitting in his quarters aboard the Terran warship Hammer of Dawn when the transmission came through. He was reading a book, an old paper book that had belonged to his grandfather. It was a habit he maintained even in space, even surrounded by technology that made paper seem ancient. His communicator beeped. He set the book down and answered. Captain, you need to come to the bridge. It was Lieutenant Park, his tactical officer. Her voice was calm, but he had served with her long enough to hear the tension underneath. On my way. The Hammer of Dawn was not a beautiful ship. She was a warship built for function, not form, heavy armor, massive engines, weapons that could crack planets. She looked exactly like what she was meant to be, a machine of violence. Walked through her corridors with the steady pace of a man who had spent 30 years in service. He was not tall, but he carried himself like someone much larger. His face was weathered, marked by scars from battles most people had only heard about. His eyes were dark and quiet, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and made peace with it. When he reached the bridge, his crew was already assembled, stood at the tactical station, her fingers moving across displays. Navigation Officer Minu was plotting something on his screen. Doctor, the ship's, was listening to something through her earpiece with a troubled expression. Play it, said. Nodded and activated the main speaker. The sounds that filled the bridge made everyone go still. Screams, explosions, desperate voices speaking in a language the translation system converted to words but could not convert to calm. Please, anyone who hears this, we are dying. The devouring tide has reached our defenses have failed. Our people are being consumed. We beg for aid. We beg for salvation. Please, please, anyone." Then static, then silence. Stood motionless for a long moment. His face showed nothing. "Origin?" he asked. "Prime," said. "Edge of conquered space. The signal is 11 hours old." 11 hours. What do we know about the situation now? Pulled up a display. Long-range sensors show massive biomass spread across 70% of the planet's surface. Energy signatures consistent with the devouring tide. Conquered fleet presence at the edge of the system, but they are holding position. Not engaging. "Not engaging," repeated. "They are watching." "Yes, sir." No one spoke. Everyone knew what the conquered thought of humans: dangerous, unpredictable, violent, the monsters from the death world. For 2 centuries, humanity had been kept at arm's length, tolerated but never trusted. And now, somewhere out there, billions of innocent beings were dying while the conquered watched. Thought of his grandfather's book. It was a history book, full of stories about Earth. Stories about people who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. Stories about impossible stands and hopeless battles and the strange, stubborn courage that humans could find in their darkest moments. "Plot a course for Prime," he said. Looked up. "Sir, space is classified as restricted for human vessels. The conquered will consider it a violation of." "Lieutenant,"'s voice was quiet, but it cut through everything. "I did not ask about classifications. Plot the course." Held his gaze for a moment, then she smiled just a little. "Yes, sir." Minu's fingers flew across his console. "Course plotted. At maximum speed, we can arrive in 14 hours. Contact the rest of the battle group," said. "All ships are to form up and prepare for FTL jump. Full combat readiness." "Sir, what do I tell them our mission is?" Minu asked. Looked at the screen at the distant point of light that was Prime. Somewhere there, people were screaming for help. Somewhere there, a species was being eaten alive. "Tell them we are going to war." The hammer of Dawn and her 11 sister ships broke from Earth's orbit. Their engines burned bright against the darkness of space. They were not going to negotiate. They were not going to observe. They were not going to monitor. The stars stretched and blurred as the hammer of Dawn jumped into faster-than-light travel. Inside the ship, the crew prepared for what was coming. They checked weapons. They studied maps. They trained in the simulation rooms. And in the quiet moments between preparations, they remembered why the galaxy feared them. Doctor sat in the briefing room with a group of young soldiers. Most of them had never met an alien before. They had grown up on Earth, surrounded by other humans, taught from childhood that they were different. Now they needed to understand just how different. 200 years ago, began, the Galactic Conquered sent explorers to our solar system. They had discovered thousands of species across the galaxy, and they expected us to be like the others. They were wrong. She activated a holographic display. It showed Earth from space, beautiful and blue and green. They landed on our planet and found a nightmare world. Gravity so strong it would crush their bones. Temperature ranges so extreme they could not survive outside their ships without protection. Bacteria and viruses that had evolved for billions of years to kill. Predators everywhere. Storms that could level cities. Earthquakes. Volcanoes. Floods. The young soldiers listened in silence. They had heard this story before, but it felt different now, on the way to their first real battle. "The Conquered classified Earth as a Category 12 death world," continued. "The highest possible danger rating, and then they found us." The display changed to show images of humans throughout history. Hunters with spears, warriors in armor, soldiers in trenches, astronauts in space. "We evolved to survive everything this world could throw at us. We hunted animals larger and faster and stronger than ourselves. We tracked them for days, running after them until they collapsed from exhaustion. We domesticated wolves and turned them into companions. We rode horses into battle. We built weapons from stone, then bronze, then iron, then steel. We split atoms. We touched the moon. Paused and looked at the soldiers. The conquered species evolved on gentle worlds. They never needed to fight because nothing ever threatened them. They see conflict as a failure, violence as a disease. They cannot understand why any thinking creature would choose to fight. A young soldier named raised her hand. So they think we are monsters. Yes, said simply. They think we are monsters, and in some ways they are right. She changed the display again. This time it showed images from the last war, the final great conflict that had nearly destroyed human civilization before first contact. They watched us fight each other. They saw nuclear weapons. They saw chemical weapons. They saw us burn our own cities and poison our own land. They saw millions die in years of conflict. When it was over, they decided that humans were too dangerous to integrate into galactic society. They established quarantine zones around our system. They built warning beacons telling other species to stay away. But we joined the conquered eventually, said. We joined as observers only, second-class members. We are allowed to trade. We are allowed to travel with restrictions, but we are not allowed to fight on their behalf. We are not allowed to bring weapons into their space. We are not allowed to interfere in their affairs. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They all knew what they were about to do. What we are doing now, one of them said, is against their rules. Smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. Yes, and Captain knows this. We all know this. But somewhere out there, billions of innocent people are dying. The conquered will not help them because they cannot. They have no warriors. They have no weapons. They have only words, and words do not stop the devouring tide. She turned off the display. Remember something when we arrive, they will be afraid of us. They have heard stories about humans their entire lives. They think we are savage, violent, uncontrollable. They may run from us. They may scream at the sight of us. Do not take it personally, just save them anyway. In another part of the ship, Sergeant Han was checking his squad's equipment. He was not a large man by human standards, but among the aliens of the conquered, he would be a giant. Dense bones, dense muscle, a body built by millions of years of evolution on a world that wanted to kill him. His soldiers sat around him, cleaning weapons and adjusting armor. There were 100 of them in total, the best ground fighters Earth had to offer. Listen up, said. I know some of you have trained for years waiting for a real mission. This is it, but this is not going to be like the simulations. He held up showing images of the devouring tide, creatures that looked like nightmares made flesh, multiple limbs, teeth and claws and tendrils, bodies that combined organic tissue with mechanical components. The tide has never faced humans before. They have only fought conquered species, beings with hollow bones that break under light pressure, beings that cannot run for more than a few minutes without collapsing, beings that die from infections that our bodies fight off without effort. He sat down, though. They think everything is prey. They have never met a predator. A soldier named spoke up. What are our rules of engagement? His expression did not change. Kill them all, every single one. They do not surrender. They do not negotiate. They do not stop, so we do not stop either. And the civilians, we protect them. That is why we are going. Not for glory, not for territory, not for resources. We are going because someone cried for help and we heard them. Nodded slowly, understood, Sergeant. Looked at each of his soldiers in turn. Young faces, old faces, men and women who had trained their entire lives for a war that might never come. Now it had come, and they would meet it head-on. One more thing, he said. When we land, you will see things that will haunt you, cities destroyed, bodies everywhere, suffering on a scale you cannot imagine. Do not let it break you. Use it. Let it remind you why we fight. Let it fuel your purpose. He picked up his rifle, a heavy kinetic weapon that most conquered species could not even lift. We are from Earth. And we are going to show the tide what that means. On the bridge, Captain stood alone, looking out at the blur of stars, approached him quietly. Captain, we have received a transmission from the conquered High Command. Let me guess, they are ordering us to turn back. Yes, sir. They say our actions constitute a violation of 12 separate treaties. They are threatening sanctions, economic restrictions, possible exile from conquered space. Was silent for a moment. What is the current death count on Prime? Checked her, estimated at 3 billion, and rising. 3 billion. His voice was barely a whisper, and they are worried about treaties. He turned to face his tactical officer. She was young, barely 30, but she had a mind sharper than any weapon on the ship. He trusted her completely. Do you know why I became a soldier? She shook her head. Because someone has to do the hard things. Someone has to make the choices that others cannot make. The conquered is not evil, they are just limited. They evolved without claws, without teeth, without the need to fight. They genuinely cannot understand why we would risk everything to save strangers. He looked back at the stars. But we can. We understand because we have always been fighting our world, fighting each other, fighting ourselves. And somewhere along the way, we learned that the only thing worth fighting for is each other. The ship shuddered slightly as it approached the drop point. They were almost there. Ignore the Conquered's transmission, said, and prepare the crew for combat. Saluted, yes, Captain. The hammer of dawn flew on through the darkness between stars, carrying the hopes of a species that had never asked for help before. And behind it, 11 more ships followed, all of them crewed by humans, all of them ready to fight. The hammer of dawn dropped out of faster-than-light travel and into hell. Captain stood on the bridge and looked at what remained of Prime. The planet had once been beautiful according to the records: blue oceans, green forests, cities of crystal and light. Now it was covered in darkness. A black biomass spread across the surface like a disease, consuming everything it touched. Report, said, his voice steady despite what he was seeing. Lieutenant worked her console with quick fingers. Surface coverage is now at 78%. The tide has consumed the northern and western continents entirely. Remaining population is concentrated in the southern highlands and orbital stations. How many survivors? Hesitated. Approximately 2 billion, down from 12 billion at the start of the invasion. 10 billion dead. 10 billion lives consumed by the hunger below. Felt the weight of that number press against his chest, but he did not let it show on his face. His crew needed him to be strong. Enemy fleet, he asked. Over 1,000 vessels in orbit. Most are organic in nature, grown from consumed biomass. They are concentrated around the primary feeding zones. And the conquered response fleet. Navigation officer Minu pointed to the edge of his display. 52 ships holding position at the system boundary. They have made no move to engage. Looked at those distant ships. 52 vessels doing nothing while a world died in front of them. He understood their fear. He even understood their logic, but he could not forgive their inaction. Open a channel to the conquered flagship, he said. The main screen flickered and showed an alien face. It belonged to Admiral of a species that resembled floating jellyfish. Its body pulsed with bioluminescent light as it spoke, a sign of stress among its kind. Captain of the Terran fleet, you have entered restricted space in violation of. Admiral interrupted, I am not here to discuss treaties. I am here to ask you one question. Are you going to help these people? His body flickered with confusion. The situation is complex. The devouring tide cannot be reasoned with, cannot be negotiated with. Our analysis suggests that if we sacrifice Prime, the tide may be satisfied and withdraw. Attempting to fight them would only. Sacrifice. voice was quiet, but it cut through the transmission like a blade. "You would sacrifice 2 billion lives and call it strategy. You do not understand. The tide has destroyed 17 civilizations. Nothing has stopped them. If we engage and lose, we lose everything. Our ships, our crews, possibly our own worlds. The logical choice is to contain the threat and hope it moves on." Was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was cold. "Admiral, I am going to give you some advice. Take your ships and move them further back. What is about to happen here is not something your species should watch." He cut the transmission before could respond. "All ships," announced over the fleet channel. "Form attack formation, weapons hot, we are going through them." The 12 human vessels moved forward. They were not pretty ships. They were not elegant. They were covered in armor plating and weapon systems, built for one purpose and one purpose only. They were machines of war, and they were finally going to be used. On the orbital station above Prime, Elder watched the human fleet advance. He had seen images of human ships before, but seeing them in person was different. They looked wrong somehow. Too angular, too aggressive, like predators swimming through the void. "Elder," Lyra said from beside him, "though they are actually attacking." "Yes," his voice was barely a whisper, "they are." The first shots were fired. The hammer of dawn launched a salvo of kinetic rounds. Massive projectiles accelerated to incredible speeds. They struck the nearest tide vessel and tore through it like paper. The organic ship split apart, spilling its contents into space. The tide responded immediately. Hundreds of vessels turned toward the human fleet and began to advance. They fired biological projectiles, launched swarms of smaller creatures, tried to overwhelm the intruders with sheer numbers. It did not work. The human ships moved with terrifying coordination. They had trained for this. They had spent centuries preparing for a war that the rest of the galaxy thought would never come. Now all that preparation was paying off. Lieutenant called out targets with mechanical precision. "Enemy cluster at bearing 275, recommending concentrated fire." "Do it," said. 4 ships fired together. The enemy cluster vanished in a bloom of light and debris. The tide pressed harder. They were not used to prey that fought back. Everything they had ever encountered had run, had hidden, had begged for mercy. These strange metal ships did none of those things. They advanced through the swarm, taking damage but never stopping. A tide vessel managed to attach itself to one of the human ships, the smaller frigate called the Iron Will. Organic tendrils began to drill through the hull, trying to reach the crew inside. Captain watched the tactical display. "Iron Will, status report." The response came back strained but steady. "We have boarders, Hammer, engaging with internal defenses." Inside the Iron Will, human marines met the tide creatures in the corridors. It was close combat, brutal and bloody. The tide monsters were terrifying, all claws and teeth and mindless hunger. They had torn through defenders without effort. But humans were different. The Marines did not run. They did not freeze. They raised their weapons and fired. When their weapons ran empty, they drew blades. When their blades broke, they used their hands. They fought with a fury that the tide had never encountered, a desperate, stubborn refusal to die. In the end, the tide creatures on the Iron Will were destroyed, every single one of them. "Boarders eliminated," the Iron Will reported. "Hull breach contained, we are still in the fight." Doctor watched the battle from her station on the Hammer of Dawn. She was monitoring everything, trying to understand how the tide operated, looking for weaknesses. And she was finding something strange. "Captain," she said, "I am detecting unusual energy patterns from the planet's surface. There is something down there, something coordinating the tide fleet." "Explain." "The tide is a hive mind. Every creature, every ship is connected to a central intelligence. I believe that intelligence is located on the surface, a nexus organism of some kind." Turned to look at her. Are you saying that if we destroy this nexus, we destroy the tide? I am saying it is possible. The coordination I am seeing is too precise for independent action. Take out the nexus, and the rest might collapse. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was more than they had before. Can you locate it? Worked her console. I am trying. The signal is coming from somewhere in the southern continent. I need more time to pinpoint it. You have until we clear these ships from orbit, said. After that, we are sending soldiers to the surface. The battle continued. More tide vessels fell. More human ships took damage. The conquered fleet watched from a safe distance, recording everything, still not moving to help. On the orbital station, Elder stood at the window and watched the impossible. 12 ships against 1,000, and the 12 were winning. He had spent his entire life being told that humans were dangerous, that they were violent and savage and could not be trusted. Now he watched them die to protect his people, and he realized that everything he had been told was wrong. They were dangerous, yes. They were violent, yes. But they had chosen to point that violence at the darkness. They had chosen to be the shield instead of the sword. Elder Lyra said softly, "They are doing it. They are actually doing it." Did not respond. He simply watched as they carved a path through the swarm, and for the first time in months he felt something he had forgotten. Hope. The drop pods fell like meteors through the infected sky. Sergeant Hand sat strapped into his seat, feeling the violent shaking as his pod burned through the atmosphere. Around him, 99 other Marines did the same, each one sealed inside a metal coffin that was carrying them toward the surface of a dying world. 30 seconds to impact, the automated voice announced. Checked his weapon one last time. Kinetic rifle, plasma cutter on his hip, on his back. Enough ammunition to fight a small war, it would have to be enough. Listen up, he said over the squad channel. Doctor has pinpointed the Nexus location. It is buried under the remains of a city called. We land 2 kilometers east and push through. What is resistance looking like? Asked from another pod. Heavy, the tide knows we are coming. Expect everything they have between us and the target. Good, another soldier named Shin said. I was worried this would be boring. The pods hit the ground hard. Felt his teeth rattle as the impact absorption system struggled to keep him alive. Then the doors blew open and he was moving, rolling out onto the surface of Prime. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Death and decay mixed with something chemical, something wrong. The second thing he noticed was the landscape. What had once been farmland was now covered in black biomass. It pulsed like living tissue, spreading tendrils across everything it touched. The third thing he noticed was the tide. They came from everywhere. Creatures of all sizes, all shapes, all nightmares. Some crawled on many legs. Some flew on wings of membrane and metal. Some simply rolled across the ground like living boulders of teeth and hunger. Contact, shouted already firing. The battle began. Human soldiers fought in ways the tide had never experienced. They did not scatter. They did not panic. They formed lines and advanced together, covering each other, supporting each other. Their weapons barked continuously, filling the air with the sound of death. Moved at the front, his rifle never stopping. He had trained for decades for a moment like this. Every simulation, every exercise, every hour spent preparing for a war that others thought would never come. Now he was here, and his body knew exactly what to do. A creature lunged at him from the left. He put 3 rounds through its center mass. Another came from above, shot it out of the air before it could reach him. They moved as a unit, as a single organism, flowing through the chaos like water through rocks. But the tide was endless. For every creature they killed, 2 more appeared. The biomass beneath their feet began to shift, trying to trap them, trying to slow them down. Soldiers started to fall. Private took a claw through her shoulder and kept fighting. Corporal O lost his weapon and drew his blade, cutting down 3 enemies before retrieving a rifle from a fallen comrade. They were humans. They did not stop. They could not stop. Sergeant called out, "We have lost 12 soldiers. Ammunition is running low." Did not slow down. Then we move faster. The Nexus is half a kilometer ahead. They pushed through the swarm. Behind them, they left a trail of dead tide creatures and fallen humans. The price was high, but they were paying it. Above them, the space battle continued. Captain watched the ground team's progress on his tactical display while his ship fought for survival against the remaining tide fleet. They had destroyed over 600 enemy vessels, but 400 remained, and the Hammer of Dawn was bleeding. "Hull breach on Deck 7, reported. Fire suppression active." "Seal it and keep fighting," said. Doctor looked up from her console. "Captain, I am detecting a surge in tide activity around the Nexus location. They know the ground team is getting close. They are pulling forces from across the planet to defend it." "Can the Marines make it through?" Did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was honest. "I do not know. They are facing odds that should be impossible." Looked at the display. Tiny dots representing his soldiers, surrounded by a sea of red. Any other species would have retreated by now. Any other species would have called this mission hopeless. But humans had a long history of doing impossible things. "Tell Sergeant to keep moving," said. "We will clear what we can from above." On the surface, received the message and allowed himself a grim smile. Keep moving, as if he was going to do anything else. The ruins of appeared ahead. It had been a beautiful city once, full of crystal towers and gentle people. Now it was a nightmare. Buildings dissolved into organic structures, streets covered in poolsing tissue, and at the center, rising like a tumor from the earth, the Nexus. It was massive, a mountain of flesh and metal, covered in eyes and mouths and things that had no name. Neural tendrils spread out from its base in all directions, connecting to everything, controlling everything. This was the brain of the devouring tide. This was what they had come to kill. "There it is," said. "That is the ugliest thing I have ever seen." "Then let us make it prettier," replied. "Plant the charges and blow it apart." They fought their way toward the Nexus. The tide threw everything at them. Creatures that had devoured entire armies tried to stop these strange, stubborn creatures who refused to die. Wave after wave broke against the human line. Lost count of how many he killed. His rifle overheated and he switched to his plasma cutter. When that ran out of power, he drew his. The weapon hummed in his hand as he carved through enemies, his training taking over completely. Around him, his soldiers did the same. The young soldier from the briefing fought like a demon despite a wound in her side, took a position at the base of the Nexus and began planting explosives while his protected him. The tide seemed to realize what was happening. The Nexus itself began to move, trying to pull away from the explosives. Tendrils reached out to grab the soldiers, to crush them, to consume them. Put himself between his people and the Nexus. He stood alone against a horror that had destroyed 17 civilizations, and he did not flinch. "Come on," he said to the monster. "I am from Earth. You have never tasted anything like me." The Nexus struck, dodged the first tendril, cut through the second, took the third in his shoulder and kept fighting. Blood poured down his arm, but he did not stop. He could not stop. His people were counting on him. "Charges set," shouted. "Everyone out," commanded. The surviving Marines ran. 31 soldiers from the original 100, all of them wounded, all of them exhausted, all of them alive. Was the last to leave, backing away from the Nexus while still fighting, still buying time. When he was clear, he pulled the detonator from his belt. The Nexus seemed to understand what was about to happen. Every eye on its surface turned toward him. Every mouth opened in a scream of rage and fear. Thought of his grandmother. She had taught him a prayer when he was a child, something to say when he was afraid. He whispered it now, the old Korean words feeling right on his lips. Then he pressed the button. The explosion was massive. Fire and light consumed the Nexus, tearing through its flesh, destroying its neural connections. The scream it made was not just sound. It was a psychic wave that washed across the entire planet, across the entire system. And then silence. On the hammer of dawn, Doctor watched her sensors in disbelief. The Nexus is destroyed. The hive-mind connection is severing. The tide is collapsing. Across Prime, tide creatures fell where they stood. Ships in orbit went dark and began to drift. The hunger that had threatened to consume the galaxy simply stopped. Captain allowed himself to breathe. Ground team, report. There was a long pause, then's voice came through, weak but alive. Mission accomplished, Captain. The Nexus is gone. We lost. We lost many good people, but it is done. Get to the extraction point. We are coming to get you. Yes, sir. Looked at the planet below. The black biomass was already beginning to die, withering without the Nexus to sustain it. It would take years to clean up the damage, decades to rebuild what was lost, but they had a future now. Because humans had given them one, the silence was the strangest part. For months, Prime had been filled with the sounds of horror, screams, explosions, the wet, terrible noise of the tide consuming everything it touched. Now there was nothing but quiet, and to Elder it felt like a miracle. He stood in the ruins of the capital city, surrounded by debris that had once been his home. The crystal spires were gone. The floating gardens were gone. 10 billion of his people were gone. But 2 billion remained, and they were alive because of the strange, terrifying creatures who had come from the stars. A shuttle descended from the sky and landed in a cleared area nearby, watched as the doors opened and humans emerged. They moved differently from any species he had ever seen. Confident, controlled, dangerous. Even when they were trying to be gentle, there was something predatory about them. Captain walked toward him, followed by Doctor. The captain was not a large human, but he carried himself like someone much bigger. His eyes were tired but alert, always watching, always assessing. Forced himself not to step back as they approached. His instincts screamed at him to run, to hide, to escape from these apex predators. But he had seen what they had done for his people. He owed them more than fear. Elder said, his voice was soft, almost gentle. I am captain of the Terran fleet. I am glad we arrived in time. In time, his own voice was shaking. You saved 2 billion lives. You stopped something that had destroyed 17 civilizations, and you call that arriving in time. We would have preferred to arrive before you lost anyone at all. Stared at the human. He could not tell if this was humility or something else entirely. Humans were impossible to read. Their flat faces showed so little, their forward-facing eyes gave away nothing. Why? Asked. It was the question that had been burning in his mind since the battle began. Your people owe us nothing. The conquered has shunned you for 2 centuries. We never offered you friendship. We never offered you alliance. We have spent generations teaching our children to fear you. Why did you come? Was quiet for a moment. He looked at the devastation around them, at the ruins of a civilization that would take centuries to rebuild. Then he looked back at. Because you asked for help, and we were close enough to hear. That is not a reason, that is madness. You lost soldiers, you lost ships, your government will face consequences from the conquered. You risked everything for strangers who would have crossed the street to avoid you. Stepped forward. Her manner was softer than the captain's, but she was still human, still something that's ancestors would have run from. Elder, she said, may I tell you a story about Earth? Nodded slowly. A long time ago, before we reached the stars, there was a disaster on our world. An earthquake destroyed a city, killed thousands, left millions homeless, and people from all over Earth came to help. People who spoke different languages, people who had different religions, people who had been at war with each other just years before. They came because somewhere strangers were suffering. That was enough. She paused. We do not help because we expect something in return. We do not help because it is logical or safe or beneficial. We help because it is the right thing to do. Because when we hear someone crying out in pain, something inside us demands that we respond. Thought about this. He tried to understand it, but his species had evolved without predators, without struggle, without the need to protect each other from external threats. The idea of risking oneself for a stranger was alien to him in the most literal sense. "You are very strange creatures," he said finally. Smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it transformed his face into something almost warm. "We have been told that before." Around them, the recovery effort was beginning. Human soldiers worked alongside survivors, clearing debris, setting up medical stations, distributing supplies. They flinched every time a human came near, but the humans did not seem to notice or care. They just kept working. Sergeant Hand sat on a piece of rubble nearby, his wounds being treated by a medic. Of the 100 soldiers he had led to the surface, only 17 had survived, 83 dead. He knew all their names. He would remember all their names. A young child approached him hesitantly. The child was tiny, with bright feathers and enormous eyes that seemed too big for its head. It looked like he was a monster, which he supposed he was from its perspective. Did not move. He did not want to scare it. He just waited. The child held out something in its small hands, a piece of crystal probably scavenged from the ruins, a gift. Reached out slowly, carefully, and took it. "Thank you," he said. He did not know if the child understood his words, but it seemed to understand his tone. It chirped something that might have been a reply and ran back to its parents. He looked at the crystal for a long time. In orbit, Lieutenant was filing her after-action report. The battle had been costly. 8 ships lost. Hundreds of crew members dead. The Hammer of Dawn itself was barely functional, limping through space with half its systems offline. But they had won. At the bottom of her report, she added a note. She knew Conquered Intelligence would intercept it. She knew they would analyze every word. She wanted them to understand. "We are from Earth. We are, and we do not abandon those who cry out for help. We silence whatever made them scream." The Conquered would spend decades debating what had happened at Prime. Some would call the humans heroes. Others would call them dangerous vigilantes who had violated every treaty in existence. There would be hearings, investigations, diplomatic incidents. None of that mattered to the people on the ground. The survivors did not care about treaties. They cared that they were alive. They cared that their children had a future. They cared that when the darkness came, someone had answered their call. Elder walked with Captain through the ruins, surveying the damage and the recovery. He was still afraid of the human, but it was a different kind of fear now. Not the fear of prey for predator, but the fear of standing next to something vast and powerful that had chosen to be gentle. "What happens now?" asked. "Your fleet cannot stay here forever. The Conquered will demand your withdrawal." "We will leave when you are safe," said. "We will help with the initial recovery, establish defenses in case any Tide remnants remain, and then we will go home." "And what do we do?" Stopped walking. He looked at with those strange, forward-facing eyes that humans used to track prey across vast distances. "You rebuild, you mourn your dead, you raise your children, you live." He paused. "And if you are willing, perhaps you remember us not as monsters, but as friends." Friends, it was such a small word for what had happened. The humans had crossed the galaxy to fight a war that was not their own. They had died for strangers who feared them. They had asked for nothing in return. Realized that he had been wrong about them. The Conquered had been wrong about them. Humans were not monsters. They were something far more complicated. They were capable of incredible violence, yes, but they were also capable of incredible sacrifice, incredible love, incredible courage. They were They came from a planet that tried to kill them every day of their lives, and that struggle had forged them into something the galaxy had never seen before, something that could be terrifying or protective depending on which way they turned. Today, they had turned toward the light. "We will remember," said quietly. "We will tell our children what you did here. We will tell them that when all hope was lost, the humans came, not as conquerors, not as destroyers, but as protectors." Nodded. He did not need thanks. He did not need recognition. He had done what humans had always done when someone was in trouble. He had helped. The sun was setting on Prime, the first sunset in months that was not obscured by the tide. It painted the sky in colors of orange and purple and gold, beautiful despite the destruction below. Somewhere in the ruins began to sing, a song of mourning for the dead, a song of gratitude for the living, a song of hope for the future. And beside them, humans listened. Humans who had fought and bled and died for a people they had never met. Humans who had crossed the stars to answer a cry for help. Monsters, heroes. They were all of these things and none of them. They were simply human, and for the galaxy that would never be forgotten. The stars shone down on a world that had almost died, but it had not died, because somewhere in the darkness there were creatures who refused to let the innocent suffer, creatures who heard a signal and came running. Not to observe, not to monitor, not to sacrifice others for safety. They came to end the threat. And they always would. They were coming, and they were angry. They were going to fight, and the galaxy was about to remember why humans were called.